everybody talks about, everybody knows about that it's an issue and a problem, and yet there's actually relatively little quality research. And I think Peter is really going to change the field in that regard. So it's a delight to have Peter today, who's a wonderful colleague and a member of our Autism Center team. So Peter, take it away.
Brad, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So thank you all so much for joining me here today at the Center of Excellence on Autism Spectrum Disorders Science of Autism series. Like Fred said, my name is Peter Wasiuk. I'm an assistant professor and audiologist here at Southern Connecticut State University. I'm a team member at the center as well. And I'm super excited to be talking with you today and really appreciate you for coming to check out this little session. So this morning, we'll be focusing on listening in noisy and distracting acoustic environments for autistic adults, which is a pretty broad topic. So hopefully we can get an overview of the scientific areas, sort of listening in noise in a relatively short amount of time. And then we'll move on to focusing on a project conducted over the past year in my lab, focused on autism and listening function, really thinking about speech recognition and following conversation in noisy and distracting environments. And the project we'll be talking about was conducted with the help of a few awesome students from the Department of Communication Disorders here at Southern, as well as with the collaboration of Dr. Barbara Cook, who's another faculty member in CMD, and Dr. Julia Irwin, who's in psychology, but is also currently serving as the interim provost here at Southern. And I really want to thank the Center of Excellence for having me as well. The work that we'll be talking about today could not have been conducted without the center's support, so I really appreciate all of them. So first and foremost, this project really focuses on an underrepresented population, as Fred said, in hearing science and audiology, which is really my scientific and clinical background, which is adults on the autism spectrum. And the fact that this population has been a bit overlooked in audiology and hearing science has always been surprising to me, because the autistic adults that I know and those whom I've worked with clinically and in the lab have often reported a myriad of auditory differences and hearing challenges. We tend to think of decreased sound tolerance, which we'll talk a bit about today, as a common auditory experience in autism, but we've sort of ignored other negative effects of competing sound that can make listening and communication function really difficult for many individuals on the autism spectrum. So let's kind of get into it. To hopefully start addressing some of these experiences and challenges, this project was pursued, the one that we're going to talk about. And we have more projects in the pipeline with individuals from the autism community as collaborators. And I'd really love it if more people from the community, as well as other scientists and clinicians, were involved with the development of future research projects as well. So please feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in being involved, if you have ideas, and also stay tuned for more work from our lab. I'd love to hear from you. Here's some contact information. We have our little advertisement for the current study up. So if someone's interested, please feel free to check that out as well. And don't hesitate to reach out to me, because I would love to chat about this topic. I really am passionate about it. All right, so to kick things off, I'm gonna give a quick overview of a scientific area that's near and dear to my heart, particularly because the environments that we'll be focusing on today are really ones that I've always struggled in personally. As people doing research, we tend to be a bit self-interested in our own problems, I think, and I'm a cliche in that regard. You know, I have real difficulties with auditory distraction. I've had attentional problems that I've dealt with my entire life, so that's why I study this topic. So today we're going to focus on the complex way that we use our ears and our brains to make sense of a chaotic and at times messy acoustic world, and particularly how we extract and focus upon the speech signals that we want to listen to, apart from all the noise and acoustic competition that's present in our daily communication environments. And we call these environments that have competing sounds, such as background talkers, noise, or music, we call them adverse acoustic environments. It's a term that we use in hearing and audiology. And hearing well in these environments is really important, because they're often where we socialize, where we connect with people, where we learn, where we work. So think about noisy, kind of chattery classrooms or open office spaces. These environments with lots of different sound sources are really pervasive in our daily lives. So a fundamental part of my research program is trying to elucidate the auditory and cognitive factors that enable us to extract or perceptually pull out, attend to, focus upon, and understand target speech in adverse conditions. So think about pulling out this blue speech waveform from this cacophony of sound here. We're doing this all the time subconsciously. So we think about, how do we do this? And when we have a hard time following conversation in these environments, we often disengage. And that's a large part of the reason that we study these processes so closely in audiology. We really want people to be able to participate and have access to all of the social environments of the world. And listening difficulties can really prevent people from engaging with their lives to the fullest extent, right? So we don't want people to disengage from conversation. We don't want them to avoid these environments. We want them to have access and the ability to participate, even if there's background noise present. So the ability to effectively process and understand speech in adverse acoustic environments is critical for functional communication. Again, as many social, educational, and vocational situations require us to focus on one speech stream or one voice, which we call the target speech, amongst concurrent competing sounds, which we tend to refer to as the maskers. So in our little silly animation here, the blue is our target speech. That's who we want to listen to, the voice we're interested in. And all these other waveforms of different colors are the maskers in our terminology. And you can literally think of a mask covering something up. It's covering the target speech up. And also, it's important to note, this is a distinct phenomena from autistic masking, although you may see some convergence or overlap between the effects of listening effort in everyday life and the fatigue that can be associated with masking in the social sense. Anyway, so as a visual analog to review how background sounds can interfere with or mask target speech during the listening process, I'm going to use a picture of my friend Lauren and me on a hike. And let's consider this picture the target image. So speech recognition can break down in these adverse situations due to two different types of masking, called energetic and informational masking. Energetic masking occurs as a result of target and masker overlap in the peripheral auditory system, with masker energy obscuring the encoding of target speech elements, thereby making them unavailable for central processing. As you can see in the visual analog of energetic masking here, the black bars are literally covering up segments of the target picture, giving us a sparser view of it. In environments with background sounds that include competing speech or other talkers, the process of recognizing the target becomes more challenging. Environments with competing talkers are often dominated by something called informational masking. And informational masking is any masking that is non-energetic in nature and tends to result from acoustic perceptual similarity of target and masker speech, or listener uncertainty as to which acoustic elements belong to the target source and which belong to the maskers. In the case of the visual analogy on the right, the two overlapping images are quite confusable in terms of their characteristics, and it becomes pretty tricky to identify the target image, right? We see that these colors of the target and the shapes are quite similar as the masker, so things get quite confusing. If we were to oversimplify this phenomena a bit, we could consider it analogous to an attentional distraction during listening. We can hear the target speech, we can kind of access it, but we're having a hard time perceptually isolating it, selectively attending to it, while ignoring or inhibiting the background voices, the background talkers. And you'll end up seeing that difficulty in these confusing, distracting, competing speech environments is really where autistic adults report struggling to follow conversation and partake. And let's listen to an example. This doesn't always work super well over Zoom, but let's try it. So here's an example of an energetic masking situation with a target sentence.
The annoying student asks many questions.
The annoying student asks many questions was the target, and you could hear that that noisy, energetic masker covering things up. And then here's an example of a sentence embedded in competing talkers, competing sentences, which is an example of informational masking.
When it did not happen, some members of the farming community wanted to find.
Hopefully you could hear that the informational masking situation might have been a little bit more confusing than the energetic masking one. Our cognitive systems, so things like our attentional networks, our working memory capacity, to pull out the audible or unobscured bits of target information and then integrate that information into a unified auditory perception. We call this process speech and noise recognition, and these types of situations with steady state noise, like the previous auditory example, are typically dominated by energetic masking. There's no real information in the noise signal. There's just energy that's covering up the target. So you can think of like an HVAC system noise or machine noise or a refrigerator, something like that. A car. It's important to note this entire listening process is happening subconsciously, right? So we're not volitionally aware of it. In situations dominated by informational masking, such as when trying to focus on a target talker while other individuals are having conversation nearby, we also have to perceptually pull out the audible bits of target information and subsequently focus upon that information and integrate it into a unified auditory percept. However, these situations tend to require us to use more of our cognitive processing resources because perceptually segregating and selectively attending to a target, apart from a highly confusable speech masker, is an attentionally demanding task, okay? Oftentimes, we need to take advantage of minute acoustic differences between the target and masker, such as differences in fundamental frequency, voice timbre, prosody, in order to successfully recognize speech that is masked by competing speech. We call this process speech-in-speech recognition. Both of these adverse listening situations require us to use cognitive resources, such as selective attention and verbal working memory capacity, in order to successfully recognize and understand the target. We tend to refer to these situations as requiring listening effort because we're using our cognitive systems to perceptually pull out and focus upon the speech signal of interest while ignoring the competing sounds. However, it's important to note that these two situations are likely not equal in terms of the degree of cognitive and attentional effort that's required to achieve successful recognition. In general, most people find listening in competing speech more challenging and effortful than listening in non-linguistic, non-informational, energetic noise. Again, this is a generalization for simplicity's sake, but hopefully you're following, and if not, please feel free to stop me. So to conceptually summarize the process of listening in adverse environments, firstly, hopefully we recognize that these situations are exceedingly common in daily life. They strain our auditory cognitive systems in that we're forced to contend with distraction or noise to pull out the target from a cacophony of other sounds. And following conversation and conversing in these environments engages our cognitive resources, and the sustained application of these resources during speech processing requires listening effort or cognitive effort. Subsequently, sustained listening effort during communication can cause listening-related fatigue. Experiences of listening-related fatigue after the sustained application of effort have been shown to negatively impact quality of life. They can increase stress during social interaction, subsequently leading to the avoidance of noisy situations and social withdrawal. It's also important to note that some folks have an easier time listening in these situations than others do. So there's tremendous variability in this skill, that is, listening in adverse environments. And I encourage you all to consider whether or not you've ever felt exhausted or tired after listening and conversing in a noisy environment. I certainly have this experience of fatigue after lots of conversation in noisy places. And many of the autistic adults that I've worked with have been relieved to know that this is a valid and common experience with robust scientific underpinnings. Okay, this experience of listening effort and listening fatigue in these kinds of noisy places. And in fact, challenges with speech understanding in adverse acoustic conditions represent the most common complaint of adults in hearing healthcare clinics, even for those with normal peripheral hearing function, meaning normal pure tone hearing thresholds on our audiogram, our primary hearing test. For example, deficits with listening and noise are pervasive in a number of populations, such as adults with sensorineural hearing loss, aging adults, young children, and bilingual individuals, particularly when they're listening in their non-dominant language. And while there's a significant body of scientific evidence that examines speech recognition in competing speech and noise for non-autistic adults, many of whom are in this population, or in these populations, much less is known about these essential auditory and cognitive abilities in people on the autism spectrum. And this lack of investigation of listening function and speech recognition for adults on the autism spectrum is disconcerting, at least to me, as this community comprises a considerable percentage of the population. Somewhere around 2.5% of adults in the US are on the autism spectrum, with projections indicating this community is expected to grow in the future. And recent qualitative work indicates that autistic adults consistently report difficulties understanding speech in the presence of competing speech and other forms of complex acoustic competition. Further, autistic adults often state that these listening difficulties are distinct from their challenges with social communication. And these listening difficulties really have widespread negative impacts on quality of life, right? They can cause stress surrounding communication in noisy and distracting environments. They have negative impacts on things like social interaction and participation, as well as on long-term academic and vocational engagement and success. And consequent stress experienced by adults on the autism spectrum in adverse environments is likely compounded by a lack of awareness of these particular difficulties by communication partners, institutions, clinicians, etc., necessitating improved awareness of autistic listening differences, particularly in adverse conditions. So that's where we're trying to come in here. What seems clear in the qualitative literature is that adults on the autism spectrum really kind of consistently report, or at least many adults consistently report, these pronounced difficulties with speech recognition in adverse communication environments. And they also report that competing speech is particularly deleterious to their listening function and social participation. Further, autistic adults report the subjective sense that their listening challenges in adverse situations are greater than those experienced by their age-matched peers. So there's this sense that they should be able to follow conversations and participate in certain environments like other more neurotypical non-autistic folks their age, but they have difficulty doing so, which leaves many individuals on the autism spectrum feeling that their listening challenges are leading to barriers in other important aspects of their life. So just to do a plug and an example, the Center for Excellence is about to have a workshop in the spring about dating as an autistic adult and relationship building. So think about how hard it can be to have a conversation in a noisy restaurant or a bar. Dating is difficult enough. It causes a lot of stress for most people. So adding significant listening difficulties to the mix is definitely non-ideal. And I just want to plug two outstanding qualitative reports about the lived experiences of autistic adults as it relates to speech recognition in adverse environments. So I have these two reports here. If you're interested, please check them out. The QR codes are attached. Email me if you're interested too. These are freely available, so check them out. They're pretty illuminating when it comes to this particular subject area. So just as an important aside, we kind of have to differentiate listening difficulties in adverse environments, which is what I've been talking about, from decreased sound tolerance. So decreased sound tolerance in autism is distinct from difficulties with speech recognition and listening function in adverse environments, but these phenomena may be overlapping. There's very little literature that currently exists exploring these two phenomena in combination in individuals with autism. So just to kind of review what we're talking about here, decreased sound tolerance and experiences of sensory overload in response to sound have long been associated with autism across the lifespan. And decreased sound tolerance can be kind of defined as an inability to tolerate everyday sounds, and it's one of the most prevalent, persistent, and disabling sensory features associated with the autism spectrum. And decreased sound tolerance, or DST, can be separated into three phenomenologically distinct conditions or experiences: hyperacusis, misophonia, and phonophobia. So hyperacusis is the perception of everyday sounds as excessively loud or painful. You can consider this increased sensitivity or decreased tolerance to sound at levels or volumes that don't bother most non-autistic or neurotypical people. There's really interesting scientific and neurological underpinnings to this. And if you're interested, please reach out to me. Misophonia is an acquired aversive reaction to specific sounds. So excessive emotional responses to very specific trigger sounds, such as chewing, swallowing, even when those sounds are presented at a very low level or low volume. Misophonia may also occur, those kinds of responses may also occur in specific situations with specific sound sources, so even sometimes with specific people. Lastly, another kind of distinct part of decreased sound tolerance is phonophobia, which is a fear of specific sounds. So this is an acquired phobia of certain sounds or certain types or classes of sounds that results in an anticipatory fear response and usually results in avoidance behavior. So if there's a certain sound that a person has developed this kind of emotional phobia towards, they'll really avoid those situations, avoid those sounds altogether, and fear responses can occur even without the sound being present, just kind of in anticipation of said sound. So again, 3 distinct components of decreased sound tolerance. So current prevalence estimates of decreased sound tolerance in the autistic population range from about 38 to 45%. So lots of folks on the autism spectrum kind of are always dealing with decreased sound tolerance experiences and issues. About 50 to 70% of individuals on the autism spectrum have experienced some kind of significant decreased sound tolerance at some point in their lives. So very, very common component of many folks with autism's lives. Decreased sound tolerance experiences really contribute to workplace challenges, avoidance behavior of certain situations and environments, anxiety, distress, fatigue. And this is considered the sensory feature of autism that has the largest overall impact on an individual's quality of life. Again, thinking about access, thinking about not being able to participate in certain environments as a result of these negative experiences with the sounds that are present in said environments. Another plug for 2 fantastic papers. If you are interested in learning more about decreased sound tolerance, potential treatments, etc., kind of the background from a neurobiological perspective, please check these 2 out. Again, QR codes will lead you there. Lastly, sensory overload, kind of overlapping with these two other auditory experiences, really is the distress experienced by an autistic individual in response to loud sounds or to too many sound stimuli simultaneously. Again, think about our adverse listening environments that we just talked about. Lots of different sound sources in our everyday environments can cause this sensory overload experience, which can lead to distress, panic, fatigue, and a desire to escape the situation. So difficulties with decreased sound tolerance, sensory overload, and speech recognition in adverse environments following a target sound while ignoring the competing sounds may all exacerbate social communication differences and limit participation in the important activities of our daily life. So we have this potential overlap of functional listening difficulties in adverse environments and decreased sound tolerance. Both can be really debilitating to social participation and quality of life, and both can cause sort of disengagement in certain environments and subsequent avoidance of certain environments. But again, these are distinct things, and they haven't really been studied in combination in the autistic population. So we don't really know what the relationship is between decreased sound tolerance, sensory overload, and difficulties with speech recognition in adverse environments. There's some face validity here. There may be some underlying relationship between these 3 distinct phenomena, but they're all common in autistic adults. They all negatively impact lives and reduce access to important activities of life. And they all may compound the core social communication differences that characterize the autism spectrum. And that hopefully leads us nicely as a little background into the purposes of the current study and the general line of investigation being pursued in our lab here at Southern. The current study that we're doing, if you're interested, is really trying to examine the relationship between decreased sound tolerance and listening difficulties in everyday life in adverse environments in autistic adults. So if you're interested, please reach out. Let's talk about it. Come and participate. But now, the current study. So the primary purpose of the current study was to evaluate the influence of competing speech maskers with high degrees of informational masking, sort of that distraction, on speech recognition for autistic young adults due to the ecological validity of competing speech in typical social environments, as well as the commonality of complaints related to distracting competing speech in the autistic population. Speech and speech recognition, being able to follow conversation while other conversations are happening around you, is a critical ability for functional communication. It's an ability that gives us access to many of the important environments of our life. So it's really important for us to think about this skill in autistic adults. So that was the kind of primary, what are we interested in here? That was our primary purpose with the study that we're about to talk about. Secondary purpose of this study was to evaluate the ability to use semantic context or top-down linguistic knowledge during speech and noise recognition for autistic young adults. So we used meaningful and anomalous target sentences. I'm going to talk more about this and hopefully explain it a bit, to evaluate the influence of sentence-level semantic context on speech recognition in both competing speech backgrounds and background noise. Part of the reason that we were interested in this is because the influence of semantic context on masked speech recognition in autistic adults is unclear, and prior work really suggests that individuals in this population may struggle to use those kinds of cues. So basically the question is, how well do autistic young adults use their top-down linguistic knowledge to fill in masked speech cues during this ongoing speech processing process? So kind of look at our glimpse representation. We have part of it being covered up by our competing sounds. How well are individuals utilizing their sort of language knowledge to help themselves fill in this missing information to successfully recognize the target speech when there's competing speech present? So prior work has indicated autistic individuals may struggle to use semantic information during language processing due to like a detail-focused style of information processing. You can think about weak central coherence account or a preference for low-level sensory features. You can think enhanced perceptual functioning account. So we wanted to investigate this in our paradigm with our participants here. We also wanted to evaluate, we collected some subjective data as well, and I'll explain this further. We wanted to evaluate the relationships between SRS-2 scores, self-reported functional listening, and experiences of listening-related fatigue in daily life for both autistic and non-autistic young adults. So we collected data characterizing self-perceived listening, functional listening abilities in the adverse environments of daily life and listening-related fatigue using valid, reliable, and common self-report tools from audiology and hearing science. And I think this is the first study to incorporate some of these sort of psychometrically valid assessments of listening function and listening-related fatigue with autistic adults. And we wanted to examine the potential relationships between self-reported autism characteristics, social communication features as measured by SRS-2, functional listening abilities, and listening-related fatigue. And I'll talk more about this. So important point to note here is that there are objective components, sort of laboratory-based behavioral components of this experiment, and there's also subjective components of this experiment. So in terms of our objective measures, we used a laboratory-based speech recognition task. We measured speech reception thresholds. So we kind of use an adaptive procedure to evaluate speech and noise recognition in both our autistic and non-autistic young adults. And the outcome variable here is called the SRT. I'll explain it a little bit further. Common variable in audiology. The goal of this laboratory-based speech recognition task was to focus on the target voice, repeat sentences from that target voice, while ignoring either two competing talkers or background noise. And this is, again, an objective assessment of speech recognition in simulated adverse environments in the lab. And then we also had these subjective measures included. So we had self-report measures of SRS2, listening-related fatigue via the Vanderbilt Fatigue Scale, and functional listening abilities in daily life via the Speech, Spatial, and Qualities of Hearing Scale. So we had kind of two components, two-pronged. What's happening in the lab if we put you in these situations? How good can you handle these background noises and pull out the target speech? And then we had these subjective measures. How do you feel like you're hearing in real life? What's your listening function like in real life? We had 40 participants overall participate. I'm going to take a quick sip, guys. Sorry about that. So we had 40 young adults participate overall, 20 individuals in the autism group. You can see our age range was about 18 to 36. So, young adults. And then we had 20 individuals in the non-autism group. And again, 18 to 33, so young adults. All participants who joined us for this research, whom we very much appreciate, had normal hearing, so pure tone hearing thresholds that were less than or equal to 20 dBHL at all of the octave frequencies in the standard clinical range in audiology. So you can think normal peripheral hearing function for all of these folks. All participants in the autism group had a clinical diagnosis of autism and identified as a member of the autism community. We did choose to have participants self-report autism traits in this study via the SRS2 to affirm and respect recommendations made by persons in the autism community, as well as ensure that females weren't excluded due to potential biases when using the adult diagnostic observation schedule to confirm an autism diagnosis for research purposes. There's some prior work that shows that could be a problem. And so we felt as though SRS2 was a valid but imperfect tool for quantifying core behaviors and social communication features associated with autism. And we kind of had folks self-report. So I'll talk about each of these components more specifically, but for the behavioral objective speech recognition task, speech recognition was measured in autistic and non-autistic young adults, again, 20 folks in each group, all of whom had normal hearing. Target sentences were either semantically meaningful or anomalous, and maskers were either two-talker speech or speech-shaped noise, so informational masker, energetic masker. You can see a visual kind of outline of our 4 listening conditions that were randomized between our participants in each group. So just these 2 different target types combined with 2 different masker types. Pretty simple experimental method here. So for our target speech materials, where we're manipulating semantic context, these are from the Revised Basic English Lexicon Corpus, which allows for the manipulation of sentence-level semantic context or meaning while minimizing other syntactic and lexical differences between the sentence types. So you can see an example of each here. We have a meaningful sentence. The professor gave an unfair grade. And an anomalous or nonsensical sentence. The windows learned in Brown secretary. Again, the meaningful sentence you can kind of predict based on context. The nonsensical sentence you can't predict. All right. So we had the same fixed target talker. So the same person, the same voice was the target talker across all 4 conditions. So we predicted that, speech recognition would be better for meaningful bell sentences where you can use your top-down linguistic knowledge to help you understand the speech in the noise backgrounds, and worse for anomalous or nonsensical sentences. This has been shown in the literature quite a bit before for non-autistic individuals. But again, we weren't sure. We're testing or thinking about how about for autistic young adults. Prior predictions would indicate that we'd expect maybe they'd have a harder time using semantic information to help themselves in these adverse listening environments. Again, our two masker conditions, we used a speech shape noise masker, which is just an energetic masker, and we used a two-talker speech masker with two competing voices. Two competing voices in the background, almost like you're sitting next to somebody who is having a conversation as you and the target talker are having a conversation. Two competing talkers have really been shown to produce high levels of informational masking, high levels of distraction, while speech shape noise, again, primarily produces energetic masking. There's no real information or distraction associated with it. So here are two masker conditions. The component that makes our two-talker masker a bit distinct, we always had this, again, same female target talker, but we used variable voice combinations from trial to trial to produce our two-talker masker. And we were trying to kind of simulate realistic competing speech environments, right? Where like a restaurant or a cafeteria where the voice combinations may be changing quite often over time. So we had 4 female talkers, 4 male talkers in the background, and these voice combinations were always quasi-randomly varying. And there were 28 possible background voice combinations overall. So again, trying to simulate the real world inside of our sound booth as much as possible. And just as a reminder, here's our 4 listening conditions. We're going to talk about results of the speech recognition task right now. So again, our 4 listening conditions are here. All participants heard both target speech types, meaningful and anomalous, in both masker types. The outcome variable for each condition was a speech reception threshold, SRT, which is defined as the signal to noise ratio, or SNR, associated with 50% correct keyword recognition. It's kind of a confusing variable because lower SRT, so more negative, is indicative of better speech recognition performance in that specific condition. Again, so 4 within subjects listening conditions and conditions were presented in a random order to each across participants, excuse me. All right, and now the interesting part, hopefully. So here are our results of the objective sort of behavioral speech recognition task. Again, this is speech reception threshold data in each of our 4 listening conditions, excuse me. And let's establish what's on our figure here first. So first and foremost, on the y-axis, we have SRT in dB signal to noise ratio. Lower SRT, so more negative, indicates better speech recognition performance. We have speech shape noise data on the left here. Think energetic masking. Two-talker speech data on the right here. Open circles and darker boxes indicate individual listener data from the autism group, while diamonds and lighter boxes indicate listener data in our non-autism group. So, and then we have our 2 different target types in each panel, anomalous on the left, meaningful on the right. So what did we find here? What did our objective data show us, our speech recognition task? So speech recognition testing revealed significant speech recognition challenges for autistic young adults compared to their non-autistic peers. And you can see this differences between our box plots for our 2 different groups here. Group mean SRTs were about 3.5 decibels higher or poorer for autistic participants in the high IM, high informational masking, high distraction two-talker speech, while there were no group differences in speech-shaped noise. This significant difference between groups in speech and speech recognition, but not in speech and noise recognition, can be visualized, again, pretty easily here. You can see the differences in the box plots in the two-talker speech panel, but not in the speech-shaped noise panel. This finding is interesting, right? So these SRT levels are what we'd expect from older adults with hearing loss in this environment. And again, this difficulty is not related at all to peripheral hearing function or audibility, as both of these groups have equivalent normal hearing. So this may be like a central or attentional difference that we're seeing here. This finding is consistent with the idea that autistic adults may be more susceptible to informational masking or like an attentional grab from background voices. and therefore they experience greater difficulties with perceptually pulling out the target speech from this competing speech than their non-autistic peers. It could be an issue with selective attention, auditory stream segregation, some of these different things. But in general, what we're seeing here is real severe distraction as a result of competing voices, whereas in speech-shaped noise, our autistic adults are performing just as well and in some cases better than their non-autistic peers. Now, when thinking about the influence of meaningful sentence level semantic context, so our anomalous versus meaningful target sentences in both of our masker types, overall, there was a modest benefit of meaningful target context for both of our groups in speech-shaped noise, while only the autistic young adults benefited from meaningful sentence context in two-talker speech. Okay? So this novel finding, these were modest benefits, but they were benefits of meaningful sentential context nonetheless. This finding indicates that young adults on the autism spectrum can effectively use top-down linguistic knowledge to enhance speech recognition in both background noise and competing speech, which really contrasts those predictions from prior work. One important caveat here is that the autistic young adults who participated in our study were primarily college students or college graduates with intact linguistic skills and no known co-occurring speech or language impairments. Therefore, this sample really isn't necessarily representative of the diverse linguistic phenotype that's associated with the autism spectrum. So while the data here indicate the effective use of sentence-level semantic context during masked speech processing for adults on the autism spectrum, and therefore contradict those prior predictions based on theories of autism, we really need to do future work with more heterogeneous samples of autistic adults with more diverse linguistic and cognitive skills. But I think this is a good thing. So to summarize the results from our behavioral speech recognition task, autistic young adults with normal hearing displayed significantly poorer speech and speech recognition than their non-autistic peers, while speech and noise recognition did not differ between the groups. Overall results indicate speech recognition challenges in competing speech backgrounds for young adults on the autism spectrum, which may relate to differences in the ability to use our attentional system to perceptually isolate and selectively attend to target speech in situations with competing voices and high degrees of distracting informational masking. These behavioral results really help validate the listening difficulties reported by autistic adults in the presence of competing talkers in that prior qualitative work that I had referred to before. So we need to start addressing some of these difficulties. Target speech semantic context improves speech recognition for both groups in speech-shaped noise. However, only participants in the autism group realized benefits of sentence-level semantic context in two-talker speech. So these results indicate that autistic young adults can effectively exploit top-down linguistic knowledge to enhance their speech recognition in competing speech and in competing noise. And that's good news. Now moving on to our subjective measures, just quickly to wrap things up here. So again, we collected a lot of self-report data too, data from the SRS-2, for example. So social responsiveness scale, second edition. This is a self-report questionnaire that's used quite often to characterize core autism characteristics and behaviors in adults, as well as self-perceived social communication function. We used the sum of all items and converted that sum to t-scores, and higher scores on SRS-2 indicate higher autism traits, characteristics, and atypicalities in social communication. Scores above 60 indicate clinical significance, but again, this is just a self-report screening tool and not a diagnostic evaluation that we did here. We also used the Vanderbilt Fatigue Scale for adults. This is a common scale in auditory science. It's a valid and reliable self-report tool for quantifying listening-related fatigue experienced in the adverse environments of daily life. So some of that fatigue that we talked about as a result of sustained cognitive resource application from earlier in the talk. 40-item questionnaire. We scored it in accordance with standard procedures. higher VFSA score indicates higher ratings of listening-related fatigue. Lastly, we use the Speech, Spatial, and Qualities of Hearing Scale, the SSQ, which is another valid and reliable assessment from audiology of an adult's subjective sense of their functional listening abilities in the complex environments of daily life. So how well do I feel like I function in all of these different adverse environments of the world? We calculated the SSQ mean total score and used our standard scoring procedures to acquire that. Lower SSQ indicates greater functional listening difficulties in daily life. So it's kind of flipped from the VFSA.
Peter,
Yep.
I'm going to give you a warning. It's 9:46.
Thank you so much, Lena. I'm almost done. Almost done. Couple slides left, and that's it. I'll be quick. So just for our subjective results here, establish what's on our figure, boxes and whiskers and all that stuff, split by group, same exact conventions as the previous figure, but just to focus on the left panel, higher VFSA 40 score indicates higher degrees of listening-related fatigue in everyday life. Hopefully you can see quite easily here, there were significant group differences in listening-related fatigue as measured by the VFSA. Lots of variability in our autism group, but again, very, very significant group differences, especially for folks that are young adults with normal hearing. And then on our right panel here, lower SSQ score indicates greater functional listening challenges and difficulties experienced in everyday life. Again, significant differences between our two groups. We did Welsh t-tests and large effect sizes were detected on both of these constructs, in both of these measures. Lastly, I think this is kind of interesting too. So looking at the relationship between autism characteristics and social communication function as measured by SRS2 on the x-axis and VFSA 40 or listening-related fatigue on the y-axis, we can kind of see here that higher higher SRS2 scores indicate higher autism traits, characteristics, and atypicalities in social communication. Again, higher VFSA 40 score indicates higher degrees of listening-related fatigue in daily life. As you can see, the relationship between scores on the SRS2 and VFSA for both groups is illustrated here with our associated correlation for each group on either side of this vertical dashed line. This vertical dashed line is the SRS2 score that separates sort of clinically significant autism features. And so the magnitude of autism traits and social communication challenges as measured by SRS2 was strongly associated with listening-related fatigue in everyday life, regardless of group status. So higher SRS2 score, more difficulties with social kind of communication, interaction, daily life, higher listening-related fatigue. I'll be very quick here. The same kind of relationship is being shown with functional listening abilities. So same relationship between SRS2 and SSQ. These are strong and significant associations between these two constructs in young adults with normal hearing. This is a novel finding. I couldn't find anything about this in the literature. So just to summarize briefly, and then we'll get into some Q&A. Subjective measure results, self-reported functional listening difficulties and experiences of listening-related fatigue were significantly higher in autistic young adults than non-autistic peers. Autism characteristics and self-perceived communication function was strongly associated with both self-reported functional listening abilities and listening-related fatigue in both groups. So this novel association between self-perceived social abilities, autism traits and characteristics, and functional listening in young adults with normal hearing is novel and requires further investigation. Overall conclusions and some final thoughts and future directions. Autistic young adults with normal hearing experience objective speech and speech recognition difficulties that correspond with functional listening challenges and experiences of listening-related fatigue in the adverse environments of daily life. Improved awareness of the commonality of listening challenges in autistic adults is essential, as sustained listening effort and difficulty following conversations can lead to the avoidance of noisy situations and social withdrawal. These listening difficulties may compound the core social features that characterize the autism spectrum, and prevent autistic adults from participating fully in their lives in society and prevent them from realizing the best academic, vocational, and socio-emotional outcomes possible. So characterizing the functional listening experiences and abilities of autistic adults while seeking direct input from individuals in the autism community is critical to developing future evidence-based support strategies that maximize social participation and quality of life for individuals on the autism spectrum. So I really appreciate you all for listening. And please feel free to let me know if you have any questions or reach out to me anytime. It's been an honor talking with you all this morning, and give me a shout.
Thanks, Peter. We do have a couple of questions.
Awesome.
The first is more of a the first is pretty easy for you to answer.
Okay.
Will you make the slides available?
I certainly can share the slides, of course.
Okay, great. Then I will just send them to me, and I will put them up with the recording.
Absolutely.
And then I have a couple questions that have come through. Would a skew in meaningful also affect the language processing, e.g., small talk versus talk on an interest?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really hard when we do these laboratory-based studies and we have to kind of strip meaning, social relevance from a lot of the linguistic stimuli, but I would imagine I don't know of any work that's examined that, but if there's an interest, for example, in either the target conversation or the competing conversation, that has to, affect your attentional resource allocation to those two places, I would imagine. Interesting future study idea, right? So there is some work showing that if the background is like really a coherent story, like maybe an interesting story, that can impose more challenges on the listener than if the background is like a series of random sentences that don't have any connection to each other. In the case of this study, the background was snippets of stories, but not necessarily coherent from trial to trial. So it's an interesting question. I would think that interest in the content of the target, for example, is always going to be helpful, I would think. But it's a really interesting question that I don't have a great answer to, unfortunately.
Okay, so the next question is, your data is very interesting. As I think about the context of my classroom where autistic individuals are part of a larger cohort, I've observed that group work is particularly challenging. Does your data lend any insight about how to enable the best chance of success for autistic students who are asked to do and be in group work where other groups are working nearby? A quieter
Yeah.
space seems like an obvious answer, but not always practical.
I know. Yeah, no, I've heard this a lot. It's another great question, like a rock in a hard place type situation. I do think the best answer would kind of be like a separate quiet space. In terms of trying to eliminate some of that distraction from those competing conversations happening in other groups, distance is always kind of a good thing. If you can I know physical separation does reduce some of the volume of the chatter as it approaches the folks who are autistic listening in a group together. But I would say, unfortunately, it's probably not the best environment for them to focus in and be able to really kind of converse with one another, focus on their group work. But I understand there's limitations when it comes to teaching. In an ideal world, wouldn't it be cool if we could have like Apple AirPods that connect to each other so we could all be wearing them and just hear the conversation that we want to hear while kind of closing off those competing dialogues that are occurring? That could be a future thing. I mean, there's lots of interesting stuff happening with AirPods and other sorts of little in the ear headphones like that. That could be a future solution. As of now, I mean, I think trying to keep as little chatter as possible within the context of group work is probably the best solution, but I know that's not always possible.
Thank you, Peter.
I hope
So
that's
I
not
have
I know it's a hard one.
two more. We have three more questions, but two are kind of linked. So I'm going to tie them together. It says, this is fascinating. What's some next steps in the research as you see it? And as a follow-up, somebody else asked, do you plan on doing a study on teenage to young adults on the same topic?
Thank you so much. First of all, I really appreciate it. Great questions all around. So the thing that we're doing right now, the study that we're doing at the moment, I kind of talked about how there hasn't been a lot of work examining kind of the relationship between decreased sound tolerance in autistic adults and listening challenges in the context of like competing voices, for example. So that's what the current work is focused upon. Future directions, I'm really interested in high fidelity earplugs. A lot of my participants talk about using like loop earplugs, for example, in their everyday lives, going to a restaurant, loop earplug. I really would like to do something examining like the functionality of loop earplugs because they seem to be helping people in real life with these environments. And so, but there isn't any real data out there to help spread the word. I mean, a lot of the purpose of this work is to like also just get awareness. I want like a more awareness in audiology and hearing about autistic individuals. So that's kind of those are some future ideas as it relates to the teens and younger kiddos. I think that would be awesome too. I would would love to please reach out if you're interested in that happening, and we can try to make it happen at some point. I think that'd be really fun.
Okay, we have one more question. One methods question. This is a methods
Sure.
question, sorry.
Yeah, I love that.
Were these all via, oh, okay. So methods questions. Were these all via headphones? I know in noise situation, I use body language to help focus on the person I'm talking to the point where sometimes I can't hear someone without my glasses.
Mm. Yeah, really great, really interesting observation. Visual cues are such a part of our listening function, right? So great question. When it comes to this experiment, again, it's in a lab. It's not that realistic. We try to make it realistic, but it's not. So no visual cues. This was done over loudspeakers. So it wasn't headphones necessarily, but rather you're sitting in a little sound booth. There's a speaker in front of you. There's some speakers around you to kind of simulate sort of a competing voice and noise situation, but there's no visual cues. So there's no face, there's no body language. Those things would undoubtedly help the person hear. But in this particular instance, we were just using auditory, just the auditory pathway. So really interesting point and exactly true, but limitation for sure of the current work. Did that answer the whole question?
I think so.
We lose Eileen?
Yeah. Sorry,
Oh,
I muted myself.
oh no, no
Yeah.
worries.
Yeah, it seems like you answered everything. I got a thank you and a thumbs up on that one.
Oh, great.
And
Okay.
yeah, and that was the last question. So, and that gives us, yeah, we're at 9:59, so perfect timing.
Thank you so much, Peter. This was great.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody for joining me. And again, please feel free to reach out. Ever interested in talking about this stuff? I'm more than happy to chat.
Thank you so much.
Just
Bye.
a reminder, everybody, we do have, we will be doing the program again next semester, and we have the first February event is up for registration.
And it should be very interesting. So thanks, everybody. Have a great holiday.